discuss this year's Rising Stars report, which features 37 artists selected by our curation team. The title of this year's report is The Next Generation of Art. So these are artists that are very forward-thinking and anticipating what's going to come in the next couple decades for artists and the art world in general. We've released this list each fall for the last 10 years, and our hope is to showcase promising artists at the beginning of their careers, many of whom have received BFA and MFAs from top programs all over the world. The selection process actually evolves over the course of a year, so we kind of start early spring, looking at BFA and MFA show pages, kind of starting to think about themes and artists that we're really excited about, and we carefully review and evaluate hundreds of artist portfolios. This year's group actually has artists based from all over. We have artists in China, we have artists in England, Scotland, Poland, Canada, and then of course kind of scattered all over the US. Our two artists today are on the East Coast. So they're both in New York, and Erin and I are on the West Coast. Oh, I don't know if I properly introduced. Erin and I are curators at Saatchi Art. Sorry, with all that waiting around, I forgot to do the introductions. This year's selection is a bit different and unique because we've grouped the artists into 5 overarching trends, kind of thematic focuses that help unite their practices, but also further differentiate the artists. I'll kind of list them out a bit briefly. We have the builders, that includes artists using varied materials like textiles and fabric. We have the trendsetters, highlighting artists who are embracing technology and kind of using different and weird kind of new mediums to further enhance their art practice. We have the activists, which features artists who are engaging with current social and political issues. The new traditionalists, who are artists that are putting a fresh spin on historical techniques and historical styles like portraiture and landscapes. And then finally, we have the rule breakers, who are artists that are creating work that really challenges the status quo. While united by these shared interests, the featured artists are also creating distinctive works that are informed by their own diverse backgrounds and individual experiences. If you haven't already, you should definitely go on saatchiart.com so you can see the complete list of this year's artists. But moving forward, we're very excited to get the chance to talk to 2 of our artists today. We have Bethanya and Dylan. And if you kind of want to briefly introduce our first artist, Erin, and then we'll ask each of them a bit about their artwork and their art practice.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Aurora. We're super excited to have both of the artists on here today and have you guys joining. So I'm going to be speaking first about Bethanya's work. We have put her in the Trendsetters group, which again, as Aurora explained, it's really focusing on artwork that's experimenting with different techniques and using alternative materials to reimagine the ways that we both experience and look at art. Bethanya received her BFA from the University of North Texas and recently graduated from the prestigious MFA painting program at the Pratt Institute in New York. Last year, she was awarded a New York Foundation of the Arts Artist Grant. And if you browse through Bethanya's portfolio on Saatchi Art, you will notice her consistent use of a vibrant color palette, which you can see in the images here, to depict highly detailed scenes from everyday life. She also uses gestural shapes and often incorporating tactile fabrics and embroidery for additional depth. Bethanya brings a new perspective and life to mundane activities like commuting or neighborhood walks. Recent Pratt Institute MFA graduate, Bethanya borrows colors from her childhood home in Ethiopia to create saturated, detailed scenes of everyday life. She often incorporates tactile fabrics and embroidery for additional depth in her work. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and feel free to just, give any input on your works, and also if anybody joining, if you want to add any questions to the chat, we will go over those in the end. But first I just wanted to ask, tell us a little bit about your process. I know that you use textiles and fabrics. So could you share a little bit about your process? Do you first start with a sketch? And how do you combine these different materials?
Yeah, sure. So I do works that are figurative and abstract separately. Sometimes I combine them. And the process for both is very different. So for when I'm doing figurative, normally I tend to photograph people, maybe when they're not looking. But also I might photograph myself and use myself as a model. And then I will just refer the images. But then when I'm working with abstract work, I have to make lists of words. And then that word, I will change it into a shape that I will invent. And then at the end, I'll take all the shapes and put them together in a way they work compositionally. And so these two processes are quite different.
It's really beautiful.
Thanks.
I'm gonna go to the next slide. So this work still, kind of when I think about spill, I kind of have more negative associations with it, like an oil spill or, you spill wine on a white shirt. But obviously this isn't negative at all with all your vibrant colors and everything. So I guess if you want to tell us a bit about what kind of the intention behind this piece was and why you named it Spill.
Yeah, so actually it started out of frustration where I realized to be perfect in life, where if it's personal, like such as trying to do a skincare and then having a pimple the next day or something like that, it can be very humorous at the same time, very frustrating things that happen in life. So I wanted to show where an area where it's always there's this small thing that will always nag me even if everything else is perfect. And so most of my abstract paintings are based on these small emotions that I will turn into like abstract work. So that's what Spill is inspired by. It is on a wood, so I use like a plywood and then I cut it, and then I also cut smaller shapes and then attach on top so that way it can add layer. So that's briefly what the work is about.
So like the pieces where it looks like a play sign, is that another piece of wood added on top to make it more three-dimensional, or is the blue, I wish I could point to it with the pointer,
some
but
shapes are layered, some shapes are not, some shapes are just on a flat painting, on a flat panel, but then certain shapes are layered. It might be 2 or 3 layers.
Got it. And the train piece on the right, I love that. It's something that I spoke about in the beginning of you depicting everyday life. And this obviously speaks to living in New York and train and transportation. Can you tell a little bit more about the inspiration behind this piece and how this maybe relates to major themes that you pursue in your art?
Yeah, so this painting is actually one of the first painting I did after I moved to New York. I felt like the train was the first thing that I experienced, and I had to take it every day to go to school and go places. And it was very diverse and alive, and I wanted to capture that moment. So basically just paying attention to every detail that I see in the train, the different characteristics and what people are doing and thinking about while in the train, like just kind of imagining what they might be thinking about. And the colors are based on what I feel like their emotion is. If I feel like somebody's more alive, then I'll make them bright. And then somebody who's calm and maybe like stressed or worried, I'll put them like in a darker color.
Yeah, and looking at the scale of both of these pieces, the train is 48 by 48 inches, which is quite large. Do you always work on a large scale like that, or is it kind of grown larger over the years as you've been painting more?
It grows larger as I add more details, because when I do on smaller paintings, it might not be easier for me to add a lot more details and more moments. Yeah. So when it comes to train, it was a lot happening, so I wanted to use a bigger panel. It would be really hard to do it on a smaller. But when I do paintings where I'm just focused on 1 or 2 figures, I like to use smaller canvas.
And you mentioned the inspiration for this is real people that you kind of see coming and going when you're taking the train. So yes, do you sneakily snap their photos, or do you kind of do a quick sketch while you're sitting down on the train?
I actually do take pictures.
Well, I guess you won't get in too much trouble, because in this case you're just using it as, inspiration as opposed to I don't know, sharing
I
out
will
their
delete it right
specific
away.
photo.
I'll delete them
Oh,
immediately,
okay.
but then I would also, I don't copy them exactly how they would look. I don't think they would recognize themselves.
No. Yeah.
So I would kind of like change it into my style. But also this work also has a little bit of embroidery and threads. I use the threads to divide certain spaces. Not a lot, but when you see it in person, there's more textures and embroidery as well.
And when you
I'm
started,
sorry, I can't zoom in. Go
yeah.
ahead, Erin, sorry.
So how do you decide if you're going to go for just strictly painting or maybe do embroidery? Do you usually stick to more like abstracts being embroidery, or do you ever do any of your figurative work and embroidery work? Does it seem to be split between, or how do you decide what materials you're going to use?
Sometimes I feel the embroidery, if I feel like the embroidery is going to take it to the next level where it's needed to add more fun, because there is this thing that the embroidery does that is so different from painting.
Yeah.
Because I can create depth if I paint first and then I add embroidery over it. Especially if I do two different colors, it will create depth that I cannot get in any other way. So sometimes I choose embroidery when I want to add more texture to the work. Sometimes if the work doesn't need it, and I did that already with the paint, I don't use it. Like this one, I didn't need a lot more embroidery on the train painting, so I only used single lines of thread. But I've done a figurative painting that has embroidery. I think it's also on the Saatchi Art. I think it's called Neighborhood, and it's about my neighborhood, and I did it entirely with embroidery. And I feel like embroidery makes me feel like I'm comfortable. Like it's a feeling of comfort, and I use it for places that I feel more comfortable in.
And was your MFA in painting, or? Yeah. Awesome.
We can kind of look at your embroidery work. This one you can see it a bit better.
Yeah, this is actually
this one purely abstracted, or are you trying to reference? Those kind of look like at the bottom, the blue and the yellow, kind of like stepstones to somewhere.
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's true, because it's fully abstract and it's fully embroidered. One of my first embroidery ever. But some images might look like a certain thing. So I choose between how much I should give and how much I should keep abstract. So in this one, I feel like it's a little too abstract, but yeah, it's fully embroidered, and yeah, it's one of my first embroidery.
And you went full large scale for your first attempt.
Yeah.
This is 40 by 30, yeah.
Yeah.
It's on canvas, so you're stitching completely through and coming back up the other side of the canvas?
Yeah. So when I first decided to do embroidery on a canvas, I did not know that I didn't have to go all the way around. So I went all the way around, but then now I realize I can just go back and forth only in the front. I don't know if you know what I mean. So this one wasted a lot of threads, and then I realized on the second one that I didn't have to do that.
So basically, the back side of the canvas will have like a whole other, because you'll see the understitching.
Yeah. Yeah, the back is actually really interesting.
Yeah.
But I have to glue the back side so the threads can like stay secure. Clear glue.
Something you had to learn before you started combining the two, for sure, huh? Combining painting and embroidery.
The glue, you mean?
Not going all the way around with the thread.
Yeah. That I learned after I did this painting. So yeah, this painting is definitely covered the entire piece in the back.
It would have been cool to see that too, but
yeah.
I think we have a video where you kind of see your process on the left. The right is like a general of our other artists in the campaign. But the end, or that part, is really fun, where you add the hair.
And gold leafing.
Yeah. I've done a work that's fully with faux fur as well, entirely faux fur.
Just very tactile with all these different materials that you're using.
I'm always trying to expand my material use, experiment and find ways to expand my work. And I wanted to do fashion designing as well as painting. So maybe that's where the textile came from.
I was going to ask you that if you had a background in fashion.
I don't have any background because they wouldn't allow me to take two majors or and so I just naturally just started using combining both of them.
I think all creative practices kind of feed into each other. So like having an eye for different forms of creativity all informs each other.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, do you want to go to the next slide, Aurora?
Sure. Thank you. So Dylan, we'll talk about you a bit. You're part of our activist group for this year. So these are artists that are exploring today's social and political issues and kind of thinking of inspiring ways that art can demonstrate resilience and courage for everyone that is also experiencing, the world that we live in. Since graduating with an MFA in photography from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2019, Dylan has been featured in notable publications like Lens Scratch and Float magazine. In his work, Dylan utilizes photo collage and still life, experimenting with different techniques to speak to contemporary art and culture while questioning traditional notions of taste, sensuality, and beauty. And in his fabricated spaces, there is no distinction between highbrow and lowbrow art or historical and contemporary art. It all kind of meshes and combines and comes together to produce these really interesting still life photographs. So we'll talk about Blue Room first. Obviously, there's just so much going on behind the scenes. If you could talk about a bit about that, like, you got to do this huge setup, and obviously these look to be very large. You're taking up whole rooms to do these photographs. So yeah, just tell us a bit about where you might start.
Sure. So this piece, like many others that I've made, was made in homage to another artist. So I've been sort of like one thread that's been running throughout my work for the past couple of years has been doing sort of tributes to artists, musicians, writers who have inspired me, often LGBTQ ones. So this one, for example, was a tribute to John Dugdale. He's a photographer who's known for his like antique and alternative process photography. So he started working in cyanotype towards the end of the 90s after he lost his vision to an HIV-related stroke. And so he had such reduced vision that it worked better for him to sort of like see in, monochrome. And so he started making these really like tender cyanotype portraits. And so I wanted to sort of do an homage to that through my work. So it started with this self-portrait on the wall I printed on a sheet of drywall, which I had done just sort of like as an experiment, and then it sort of turned into a prop for this photograph. I was looking at it and I realized, I had been taking some photos that were sort of just like smaller tabletop still lifes. And then as you were saying, I realized that I could sort of just start to take over the whole room. So I printed this wallpaper out with, I made cyanotypes and then I scanned them back into the computer and enlarged them to, like huge scale. I made additional cyanotypes to place in the room, like the floral arrangement. And then I brought in like different fabric and pedestals and florals to create this room. Yeah.
Very cool.
It's so
cool. Each photograph, yeah. It's like a lot, but it all comes together so beautifully that it's it's not too much to take in. But definitely you can find something new every time you look at the photograph, which is really fun. We'll move on. Well, actually, is the one leaning with the flowers, is that one you also took as well?
Yeah, that one I scanned out of a wallpaper book, the floral.
Oh, okay.
And then I exposed it in like a UV unit with cyanotype and then just sort of added the graphic element on top.
Okay, that's
so all of my work is like, for the most part, it's re-photography. So I'm like photographing things, printing them out, photographing them again, sometimes printing them out and photographing them again. So, and then, there'll be scans, fabrics, sort of all these different like visual languages mixing together.
Yeah, again, very tactile, which is different for a photograph. Okay, we'll move on to your next two pieces.
Yeah. So for your gray room, similar to the blue room, but now it's, in this gray scale. Can you tell us a little bit the idea behind this photograph?
Sure.
And why the tulips are in color and then the rest of the objects are in a gray scale? Did you Photoshop the tulips, or is it just that it truly is the only color and the rest of the props are in that gray scale?
Oh, yeah. So I made this piece in homage to George Platt Lyons, who is also another fashion photographer. He was well known for doing like lots of catalogs and fashion shoots. But throughout his whole life, he was doing these really incredible like male nudes. And they actually are like, really the art that he's known for now, but no one had seen them until after he died, and he had destroyed a lot of the negatives and things like that. And so I was sort of inspired by this to sort of then create a whole like blue room, to create a whole room based on this idea of black and white or grayscale. So I put it all together, and the reason those flowers ended up in color is as I was putting it together, I realized that you couldn't really tell if I shot it in black and white or color. And I wanted it to be obvious that it was a color photograph purposely like constructed in black and white.
Yeah.
And that's how they ended up in there.
I know if you were to look really quickly, it almost looks like it could be a charcoal drawing or something that's done in black and white, but it's actually a photograph. It's really cool.
Thank you.
The floral pops up, the flowers pop up a lot in your work. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, so first of all, I love flowers. I have like tattoos of them, and so there's a lot of meanings of, it's obviously one of the oldest tropes in art, and that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, is sort of like revisiting tropes. It's the sort of trope where it's like it's the most, probably, if you look at all of art, they like probably reappear more than almost anything besides the human figure. And yet like different artists keep finding different ways to use them, whether it's, like Dutch still lives, or, there's like Taryn Simon did an amazing series where she sort of like looked at different political agreements, and realized that when these truces were made, there were like floral arrangements in the background, just sort of decorating the space. And so she did a whole series based on that, on like failed political agreements. And so the more I looked into like, wow, there's so many different ways that flowers can be used in art. I kind of wanted to work them into my work. And so I'm often using them symbolically. So like I started using like certain flowers that reminded me of family members or friends. I don't think I put any of them on Saatchi, but I did like, I did a photograph of a green carnation for Oscar Wilde, because that was sort of like a symbol. He used to wear one in his lapel, and then after his trial and when his imprisonment, people would sort of like use that as a signal. Yeah, so that's sort of, just some of the usages.
Yeah, flowers are so interesting because you get flowers for celebration of like life, and like flowers are in all areas of life and any age. I love that.
Okay, next we'll talk about garden. This is obviously a bit different than your typical very constructive photographs. This one, I would assume you went out and you took it at wherever this very, I don't know, it could kind of be anywhere, which is well, maybe not maybe not over here, but anywhere kind of on the East Coast, any old institution or school or something.
So that one's actually, that piece is an homage to Oscar Wilde, who's, again, like, he's such a huge influence on my work. I've always loved his writing, and I was like working on this series in grad school originally. And I was rereading, one of my favorite books, and it's The Picture of Dorian Gray. There's like a line in the preface where he says, all art is at once surface and symbol. And it really spoke to me with what I was doing. Because I'm often using like these symbolic props and then making everything sort of like very flat and two-dimensional, even though they're 3D spaces. So I wanted to make a couple pieces in homage to him. So this piece is actually the framed photograph is a picture of his tomb in Paris. There's all these like lipstick kisses on it. So it used to be like a tradition that people would walk by and leave a red lipstick kiss. It's now blocked by a plexiglass barrier because they realized that the kisses were like slowly degrading the tomb from whatever chemicals are in lipsticks. So unfortunately you can't see that anymore, but I thought it was great to find like an archival photograph of that. And then the background is a photograph that I took like on my way to visit his tomb. And so this was one of the first pieces I made during like COVID lockdowns. And I started to think about like, oh, what if I started making photographs of like the outside world, but at home? And so I started like mapping them back onto my wall, and then, you know, hanging art over them.
Well,
Yeah, because it comes together so cohesively, you don't immediately see the fact that they are layered.
Mhm.
But yeah, no, that one's beautiful.
Thank you.
a question.
I'm gonna show too what your I was gonna show too your work, what they look like framed, just because the frames are beautiful. But go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, it looks really nice. A question for both of you guys. You know, in us thinking about this Rising Stars initiative that we do every year, we really try to highlight artists that we think are, you know, cutting edge, doing things that are something that are going to be continued to see in the art world. And both of you guys exemplify, you know, whether it's using different materials or this really interesting layering of photos and collage work. And we find that really exciting, but I would love to hear from both of you guys. What do you think the future of art for yourself or art in general is going towards? I know it's a large question, but what excites you about the future of art? Dylan, you want to go first?
Yeah. I don't know about the future of anyone else's art.
Oh, sorry.
I'd say for myself, at least, where I'm going is like what's happened for me is like you know, I've always loved photography. I've been a photographer probably since like freshman year of college, but I also really like working with my hands and being very tactile, which is like obviously involved in a lot of the like collage work that I do. But I've definitely thought of sort of flipping it back over, which is like, you know, turning the photographs back into real life objects somehow. I had like a show earlier this year where I sort of like printed out like a big photographic wallpaper. And I'd like to, and then like put the photographs back over it. So it kind of looked almost like the previous garden photo. So I'd kind of like to start thinking of like more installations or pieces like that, where it sort of like goes back into a like three-dimensional object, or it's a space almost to enter into, if that makes sense.
I love that you're really exploring the idea of installation while still doing photography. And I think that's a really unique, I think you usually feel installation with, you know, like materials like fabric or ceramic or like really physical items, and you don't see it as much in photography. So I think it's a really interesting idea.
Should I continue?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, the stage is yours.
So for me, I see myself making sculptures. It's something that I wanted to do for a while, whether that is ceramics, wood, or metal. I want to go more on the 3D routes. Also, there is NFT, the rise of like technology. So maybe my abstract art's turning into a certain type of animation, like movements. And then combining furniture designing with my art is what I plan to do in the future.
Yeah, I could see your train piece being something digital, maybe like the having interactive.
They're all moving. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very cool. Well, we want to open up the space for any questions that some of the participants have submitted. So I'm just going to check and see if we have any. And feel free if either of you guys have anything else you wanted to share about your work, feel free to hop in as well. Okay, looks like one question here for Bethanya. Someone asked, who are your biggest influences and why with your artwork? or I guess it could be not even just your art. Who are your influences?
I've always loved Kandinsky, Leslie Kandinsky. I feel like some of my compositions might relate to that. I just love Kandinsky, and I like Paul Gauguin, and recently Shabala Self, and Nina Chanel Abebe. Those are one of my favorite artists. Yeah.
I definitely see the Paul Gauguin. I think the Kandinsky, do you listen to music a lot when you're making your work? Do you have like a lot of influence with, that's what I think of when I think of Kandinsky with his work, is a lot of musical.
Yeah, I don't think my work relates with music. I know he does. I actually thought about trying that when I heard Kandinsky does that, but I can't relate mine with music.
And he's just like a purist with color. So with your abstracts, that makes sense as well. I think he's, really working on exploring what line and shape and color all does with each other. So that makes sense.
Yeah, that's true.
And Dylan, a question for you is, someone asked, how do you hope your viewers would respond to your works, and what sort of emotions would you want them to feel?
I've thought about this a lot before, because sometimes, like, for example, when I was talking about like the green carnation idea, like I'm interested in people who know what that symbolizes having one response, and then other people who don't know what that symbolizes maybe being a bit like, visually interested but not knowing exactly. And so I would hope that it would make them maybe like either ask me or look it up, or sort of like inspire investigation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The symbology behind it, you hope it like piques people's interest at kind of like what might this mean.
Yeah,
that's great. I think that's all the questions that I see.
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Erin. I was gonna just move on to the next slide. So that is the end. This is another artist we have in the report, Mitch Miller. And then if you wanted to do the call out for art advisory, Erin.
Well, thank you guys so much both for joining. We're so excited about the Rising Stars, and specifically both of you guys, thank you for joining and sharing about your work.
Thank you very much.
For anybody that's joining the call, please feel free to reach out to our art advisory curation team. Here's a lovely photo of all of our faces. But our email is here at the bottom, curator@saatchiart.com. So if you have any questions about any of the works that you saw in the presentation today, or just want more information about the Rising Star class this year, we are happy to help. And thanks again for everybody joining.